Hello, welcome to America. This is Hego, have a good one. Another episode. This is America. Now, quick question. Who here has not heard of Hamilton? What? You have not heard of Hamilton? How dare you? Well, in that case, I guess you're going to have to listen to this in order to educate yourselves on this Hamilton. Full name is Hamilton, an American musical. It is, as the name would suggest, a musical that is American. It is about a guy called Hamilton. Shock horror. His full name is actually Alexander Hamilton, which I personally reckon is a very cool name. But in case you don't know anything about American history, Alexander Hamilton was one of the founding fathers of America, alongside other guys who are more well known, like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, those kind of guys. Hamilton is the guy that's on the $10 note. And most people didn't know about him until this show came along. Hamilton was originally performed, it was first performed in 2015, where it received uniformly positive reviews and high box office sales. The show draws heavily from hip-hop, as well as R&B, pop, soul, and traditional style show tunes. The main appeal of the show is the fact that it's one of the most well-known musicals that predominantly raps rather than sings. So that's kind of what it's best known for. But nowadays it's also known for being a very well-told story. And I will say, full disclosure, this isn't a review, so I'm just going to tell you right now, it is a very good show. So, if this isn't a review, what is this? Well, pretty much what I'm going to do is I'm going to be looking through this show and the morals that it shows us in the show and how well that upholds in modern day society. Now, yeah. And in fact, actually, Hamilton was kind of the first thing that kind of gave me the idea to make this whole morality of a certain musical into a proper, legit thing. I know that Pippin was the first one that I did, but this one was the one that made me think, actually, I could do this more than once. So, here we have it, the morality of Hamilton, but I'm not going to have that as the title, because that's a little bit, I don't know. Now, a thing worth mentioning is that there are going to be a few big buzzwords that you're going to hear a lot throughout this show. Some of them include legacy, time, independence, and revolution. All of those words get repeated a lot of times, and it actually does have relevance to the whole story as a whole. Now, I've seen the musical before, but I haven't seen it live. I've seen a recording of it, and I have seen the Disney Plus version of it, but I haven't actually seen it live. So this is my input on what morals this musical teaches us, and how this upholds in modern times. Given that the musical came out in 2015, I'm imagining it'll still hold up, unless the show is actually just extremely dated. So, we start off with the opening number, Alexander Hamilton. Now, in this song, we get a lot of the major players in this show basically retelling Hamilton's backstory. We get Hamilton's backstory. He was born out of wedlock in poverty and a broken family. That's a really hardcore origin story. Now, we understand why Alexander became the person that he did. For those of you who aren't familiar, he mentions a few things. He says, When he introduces himself, actually, he says his name, and then he says, "There's a million things I haven't done, but just you wait." He is determined to make a difference in the world. And then during the chorus, the ensemble mentions that he could never back down and he never learned how to take his time. So he seems to be a very determined individual who never slows down for anything. And this song shows why that's the case. Given the circumstances of his early life, he needed to push himself forward and force his life to change if he wanted to survive, especially since a hurricane came and destroyed his entire town. So he needed to do all of this to survive, let alone live a comfortable life. He always had a strong desire for change, constantly fighting for more, which is what we get from the opening number. We get the who, what, when, where, and why of everything, as well as a writing trope that was actually very popular among Shakespearean plays. A rundown of how the story is going to end, with Hamilton being killed by Aaron Burr, basically spoiling the story for everyone. I would say spoiler alert, but like, the thing is, they basically tell you that he's gonna die at the end. So they're not really keeping it a secret at all, which is interesting. On the one hand, I get it, because it is a semi-biographical story. And anybody who's familiar with Alexander Hamilton, the real-life figure, will know that he got shot in a duel. So it kind of brings up an interesting point about spoilers. I might elaborate on this in a later video, but basically, knowing how a story's going to end can actually enhance the overall experience, because instead of looking for how it's all going to end, you're looking for how it reaches the end point instead. It's like, you know the point A and you know the point B, so it's like, you're kind of wondering, how do you actually get to point B? Rather than being like, what is the point B? It's interesting. And I'm not entirely sure if there is a more effective way of storytelling, to be honest. But anyway, I will say that I think knowing how the story's gonna end is usually more interesting. We know that the story will end with Aaron killing Alexander, but how? We shall find out. Also, full disclosure, Alexander Hamilton was, it was my favorite song from Hamilton for a while. Like, when I first started hearing of Hamilton, this one was my favorite. Granted, I hadn't really heard that many other songs in it, but I loved this. Next up, we get to Aaron Burr, Sir. We get a proper introduction to Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. By the way, in case you don't already know, Hamilton is one of those musicals where the entire show is told through musical numbers, rather than any traditional drama scenes. It's kind of similar to, like, Les Miserables or Jesus Christ Superstar. Everyone either sings or speaks in verse and raps. Apparently, the reason why Hamilton is hip-hop based, or like there's a lot of rapping involved, was to show off Hamilton's intelligence. The use of rapping shows how eloquently and quickly he can think and speak. Especially when he's rapping while someone else is singing. It kind of shows that he's thinking and speaking at a much faster pace than them. Which is kind of it's a really nice, subtle way of showing Hamilton's intelligence. Because he was considered a really, really smart dude. Like, a genius, straight up. Which I'll elaborate on more. Anyway, we see where Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton differ in personality and principles. By the way, Hamilton comes up and speaks to Burr, and speaks about about Burr's life, Hamilton kind of sees Burr as a bit of an inspiration. He's like, oh, like, how did you graduate so quickly? And you can tell that Burr is kind of, he kind of wants to end the conversation as much as possible, so he's just like, oh, it was my parents' dying wish before they passed. And normally, in most conversations, you would have the person listening be like, oh, and then they'd kind of like awkwardly back out of the conversation. But instead, Hamilton doesn't do that. He's just like, wait, you're an orphan? Ah, of course, I'm an orphan too. Dang, we have so much in common, man. So that didn't really go as he was planning. But Hamilton keeps talking with Burr, and Burr kind of realizes that he's not really going to get away from this soon. So he's like, hey, can I buy you a drink? And then he's just like, okay, so while we're going, I'm going to give you some free advice on how to get ahead. And it boils down to talk less, smile more. Don't let them know what you're against or what you're for. It's a very surprising reveal for Hamilton. Because he's he's surprised by what Bird said. He's just like, seriously? That's it? You can't be serious. And this is where we see where the two differ. Hamilton has lived his whole life by pushing to get ahead as much as possible, unapologetically stating his beliefs and loudly professing something if he believes it to be right. Which you're going to be seeing a lot of throughout this show, so hope you're used to it. He lives life being brutally honest in every manner of life, even if it doesn't seem immediately beneficial for him. Burr, on the other hand, as I'd said before, goes by the philosophy of talk less, smile more. He lives his life being very cautious and trying not to step on any toes, which, as we've probably figured out in life, is basically impossible to do. Like, you can't satisfy everyone in life, no matter how hard you try. So there's really no point in bending over backwards in that regard. In the process, Burr never really takes any stances and never states his opinion on anything. To paraphrase Alexander himself, Burr stands for nothing and therefore falls for nothing as well. It's rather effective for not making enemies, but not an extremely authentic way of living. Which is kind of what Burr is going by. It's kind of the approach he's going for, considering he says, fools that run their mouths oft wind up dead. So, he's very concerned about his survival, and he feels like making unnecessary enemies is just like, it's just gonna get you killed. Which, bear in mind, this is like the late 1700s, so people did die a lot more often than they do nowadays, particularly in America. Discluding that year. Anyway, I reckon Victor Hugo and Charles Mackay would both likely take Hamilton's side in this conflict of principles, considering their stance on making enemies. They've both said different lines of basically, if you have never made enemies, then you've never stood for anything in your life. It's one of those two guys, they made a quote that Winston Churchill always gets credited for, even though Churchill didn't actually make that quote himself. It was like taken from somebody else. Personally, I would say that I kind of tend to be more of a Burr in life. I keep my stances very close to myself because while I agree to be authentic, there's also a matter of picking your battles because, you don't have to die on every single hill in your life. But I have been trying to be more, I guess, not so much honest, but more, I guess less afraid to, like, speak one's opinions. And I will admit, actually, this podcast, I reckon, has helped me out with that. Granted, the stances that I take are not particularly serious, like, you know, what language has the best words for what and which chip flavors are best. But anyway, while they're going for this drink, Hamilton also makes close friends who are all similarly outspoken about their goals and beliefs. We get John Lawrence, who has openly criticized slavery and aspires to help recruit slaves to fight for their freedom and create the world's first all-black battalion. We have Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocrat who dreams of life without the monarchy. He strongly believed in the American cause during the Revolution, hence why he went over to support them, and is currently here now. And we have Hercules Mulligan, who, historically speaking, would have actually been Hamilton's first friend after coming to America. Fun fact, at this point in the real-life story, Alexander would have only met Mulligan and Burr, since Lawrence and Lafayette were both elsewhere, like overseas somewhere. Mulligan, anyway, is a tailor's apprentice who's historically opened up a haberdashery that catered to wealthy redcoat soldiers in New York, which made British soldiers trust him. I wonder if that's important to what ends up happening later. Anyway, all of these cats are very outspoken about themselves, which means that Hamilton gets along well with them. And they don't get along quite as well with Burr, because they're like, hey, drop some knowledge, and Burr's like, nah fam, I'm not gonna do that. And everyone's like, you suck! Anyway, this is when we see... This is where we get to My Shot, which comes in immediately after Aaron Burr, and has kind of become like the flagship song of Hamilton. It's like, if there's one song that people know from Hamilton, it's either this one or Alexander Hamilton, but people tend to go for My Shot more because it shows more of Alexander's character and personality. It shows things from his perspective, because before this point, we haven't actually gotten Hamilton's I Want song, for lack of a better word. Every musical has an I Want song for their characters, showing us what they want, showing the world from their point of view, and the previous two songs haven't been that. Alexander Hamilton was basically a narration of his life before going to New York City, and Aaron Burr kind of just showed him interacting with other people. My Shot shows his goals, his personality more. He's got a lot of brains, but no polish. He wants to create a better future for America and will fight to the death for it, literally. At this point in time, Hamilton actually has a similar mindset as Pippin, funnily enough. They both want to fight in a war, not so much for a purpose in life, like Pippin was, but more because for Hamilton, as far as he's concerned, he's either going to die in glory or advance in his goals. He's been born with basically nothing, and a war is the best place for him to advance societally, because if he dies in the war, he'll go down in glory, and his legacy will be preserved as a hero. Whereas if he actually survives and makes a name for himself in the war, he will advance societally, because in this day and age, everybody's class was kind of like stuck with wherever they were born in. And obviously Hamilton wasn't born in a very rich family, so those were kind of his only options. His only real option as far as advancing and moving up in class was if he committed great actions in war. And then if he died during the process, then, I mean, he doesn't really need to worry about his life anymore. Alexander is done waiting and is going to start really fighting, both verbally and physically. And this is what gets him to make friends with those three other characters I'd mentioned before. Burr is a lot more hesitant to join, Because it's like, he's like, I agree with you guys, but you can't go around just spouting your opinions like that. Because otherwise you're gonna get killed. You're gonna make enemies who are gonna want to kill you. But Hamilton is just like, bruh, like, no. Like, we've got such a strong group, and if we aren't willing to fight for our ideals, what's the point of having them in the first place? So then, we get to Story of Tonight. The Four Musketeers are all excited to help build a new future, and this song really shows a strong theme of Hamilton. The idea of legacy and creating a story of yourself that outlives you. Because they start singing all about how like, you know, they will join in the fight even though they may not live to tell the story. Even if they die, their children will be able to tell it for them, and they'll tell the story of how it all went down. They look forward to the idea of having children who tell their story for generations to come, giving their phrasing, like using the word when rather than if, tells us that this is all a certainty, and nothing wrong will ever happen from this point onwards. Also, it's worth remembering the line of raise a glass to freedom, because it does come up a few times. It's believed that they say that it's something that they can never take away, no matter what they tell you. Basically, like, as long as you hold up your ideals as a priority, nobody can really force them away from you unless you let them. So if you refuse to budge, your ideals will be safe. I remember actually seeing a YouTube channel, it was called Howard Ho, and he has this series that's called How Hamilton Makes You Cry, or like How Hamilton Makes This, or something like that. He speaks a lot about musical theory and how Hamilton affects the emotions with the music of it all. Not just the lyrics, but like the instrumentals and that. I recommend watching this guy's stuff, even if you know nothing about musical theory like me. But he mentions how Story of Tonight is rather unique in the Hamilton playlist, because it takes way longer to get to the main chord progression than all the other songs prior. Alexander Hamilton took 4 seconds to get to the main chord progression. Aaron Burr took 2 seconds, and My Shot took 5 seconds. Story of Tonight takes 22 seconds. And he mentions that this is representative of how the Four Musketeers, I'm going to call them the Four Musketeers from now on, the Four Musketeers have had to struggle to reach the point they're at now. They've had to struggle before they could even dare to hope and look towards a brighter future. And the fact that it takes so long to get to the main chord progression shows that struggle. And then the main chord progression is extremely optimistic. It's hopeful for a brighter future. And I am absolutely sure that this bright future will occur. But before we get to that point, we've got to get to the Schuyler Sisters, another very popular song. This song serves as the introductory scene for the Schuyler Sisters, Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy, very significant characters for the rest of the story. Well, 2 of them, anyway. We know that Angelica is very outspoken with what she wants, and reveals how she's intellectually starved. She's looking for a mind at work. And kinda suggests that she's on a different level intellectually to everyone else around her. Eliza's just happy to be there in the downtown area of New York and seeing so much change and feeling lucky just to be alive at that point. Peggy is more like, hey, we gotta go home, Daddy doesn't want us here. And the other 2 are like, ooh, look, a revolutionary. Angelica also gets hit on by Aaron Burr a little, and she seems to have rather high standards, since he disgusts her, and she wants nothing to do with him. So, this one song provides us some very good insight into who these three characters are, particularly Angelica. Next we have Farmer Refuted. We have Samuel Savory, brilliant, another frickin' Sam. Every story has to have a Sam in it, seriously. Like, pick a story, any story. I guarantee you there is a Sam in it somewhere. Even if they're like a totally irrelevant character like this guy. I'm just kidding, I can't be too hard on this Mr. Savory, even though he shares my frickin' name. Because he does actually have a little bit of impact. You won't see him again after this song, keep in mind. But anyway, Hamilton roasts the dude to oblivion, questioning why a country across the sea should control America. And we see more differences between Hamilton. Hamilton, who would rather be divisive than indecisive, and Burr, who would rather just let sleeping dogs lie and would rather not get involved because it's just going to cause an unnecessary conflict. Hamilton obviously doesn't listen to Burr and just starts roasting Savory, and from what I gathered, this makes the, this comes to the attention of Britain themselves. And we get introduced to King George III, who at this point is obviously the King of Britain, and by extension, it basically owns America. We get his song, his own song, You'll Be Back, which is, it shows his thoughts on everything. He's like, look, I love you, like, America, I love you guys so much. I will show you how much I love you by killing your friends and family. Da 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 da. Honestly, King George is the easiest role in the show. He only has to sing one full song and then 2 half songs in the whole show. And it's not like he even really needs to try that hard. And he gets to just stuff around in the second act, and he's a fan favorite. Seriously, when I went to see the show, people were laughing after the first 2 seconds of the song, and George hadn't even done anything yet. Anyway, King George is a very minor role in the story, but he is a consistent source of comedic relief, which is going to become more important later on. You'll Be Back is a great breakup song. You know, one of the greatest breakups in history between America and Britain. And nowadays, it seems that these two are still not fully over it yet. In fact, actually, the same guy that I had mentioned before on how Hamilton makes you cry, I'll give a link of his channel in the description, but he had mentioned that like this song, You'll Be Back, is inspired a lot by Beatles songs, which makes sense because it was like, Beatles was like, it was like English, like 60s rock or pop or something like that. Which kind of shows the difference between like that and America, where everybody's rapping in hip-hop, which obviously hip-hop is very popular in America. Anyway, after this song, war is officially declared on the 2 countries. And then we get Right Hand Man. Awesome song. Awesome song. But it also serves as the introductory song to George Washington, who I'm sure you've heard of before. An established general at this point in time, leading the revolution. We also get an awesome bit at the beginning where several civilians are seeing the British troops looming over them, and everyone starts running away except for the Four Musketeers, who stay, watching, and deciding to rise up. Also worth mentioning, the actor who played George Washington has in the version I watched, he had a really nice booming voice. Like, I reckon he would make a good Mufasa voice. Also, since we're still talking about neat pics here, I forgot to mention in my shot, one thing that I always loved was like, during one bit in the choreography, someone like throws a chair at Hercules Mulligan, and Mulligan just catches it with one hand, like a badass. I don't know. I'm not sure how many people noticed it. I don't know how many people have noticed it, but that's just always fun to watch. He just catches it with one hand like it's nothing. Anyway, Washington is shown as being this awesome general who's unstoppable. At least that's what everyone sees him as in the show. But in actuality, he undergoes a lot of stress during this time because the stakes are so high, and Washington does not hide this from the audience at all. He's being very honest with us, which gives us an idea on Washington as a person. He's very honest and very forthcoming. Maybe not quite so much as Hamilton. Hamilton is honest, like, to a fault. He is honest even when it's actually bad for him to be honest. Washington isn't too honest, but he's still very honest. Anyway, he gets approached by Aaron Burr, and we get another example of Burr and Hamilton's differences. Burr asks for permission to state his case, something that you likely wouldn't see Hamilton doing ever. In fact, he speaks even when people don't want him to, so there's that. Also, I reckon cannons should be used in more musical pieces, because cannons are fired during Right Hand Man. Not real ones, obviously, but I reckon real ones would have actually added to it. Kind of like in the 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky, which I only know about because they fire cannons in the song. Like, legit cannons. It's a banger of a song, Right Hand Man. Really brings the house down. Anyway, so this is actually mentioned in Genius Lyrics. During the bit where Burr is speaking on behalf of himself to Washington, Burr doesn't actually come up with new rhymes here. Assistance and distance were Washington's words from just a verse ago, literally parroted back to him. This reiterates Burr's fatal flaw of adjusting his beliefs to meet the situation at hand, rather than holding fast to his own values. And as for firing from a distance, this is again typical of Burr, who never met a position he couldn't abandon. Still, this is where Burr loses his shot at Washington's support. Washington may have found himself forced to engage in a distance strategy, but it definitely wasn't what he wanted. And regardless, Washington has no interest in yes men. In his own words, he's all about the talk less without the smile more. Meanwhile, read another way, the line can be structured as, I from a distance admire how you keep firing on the British. Thus, not only is he complimenting Washington on this particular military strategy, but he's doing so while himself staying out of the fray. Miranda is reminding us that Burr stays out of all fights, metaphorical and literal, which is kind of weird considering he wants to, join a war, but he wants to be Washington's right-hand man, which wouldn't actually involve a huge amount of fighting. Anyway, Burr spends forever actually getting to his point as well, spending more time talking himself up and complimenting Washington, while Hamilton is much more direct to a fault. This is partly why Burr was rejected by Washington in this exchange. Also, Hamilton was invited to see Washington, while Burr went to Washington of his own accord. Also, I'd read that when Hamilton shows up, the strings change from Washington's theme, History Has Its Eyes on You, to Hamilton's theme, Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, so Washington shoos Burr away for several reasons. One, Burr took forever to get to the point and just spent the whole time complimenting Washington, as well as just signifying that he's kind of a yes man and very fickle. Washington didn't want any time with him. Anyway, Washington gets Hamilton to become his right-hand man, and Hamilton immediately starts to provide ideas on how to help out the war effort, getting his friends to help and some spies so they can stay ahead of the British plans. So now we've cut a little bit to 1780, a winter's ball. Burr may be really annoyed with how far his friend is progressing in his career, but he agrees that they're both reliable with the ladies! Historically speaking, they ain't just, those two, Burr and Hamilton, they ain't just hoes. They the whole gardening kit. This leads immediately into the song Helpless, Eliza Schuyler's song. Well, one of her songs anyway, but her first one. This song's definitely the happiest song that she sings, and I'd say probably one of the happiest songs in the entire show. It's all about how she meets Hamilton and falls in love with him at first sight. Angelica introduces her to Hamilton, and they write letters to each other endlessly, eventually culminating in the two getting married, and it's all really happy. By the way, yeah, this is probably the happiest song in the musical, so I hope you felt good about it, because we lead then into Satisfied. The setup for this song is Angelica's giving a speech to the newly wedded couple, and it seems very standard. Actually, wait, I just remembered, another neat pick during Helpless is the fact that Mulligan's the flower girl, and like, he did the best with what he had, but like, whoever was in charge of the flower girl stuff really let him down, because he only had 2 petals to throw. Dang it. Poor Mulligan. Anyway, yeah, so Angelica's giving a speech, seems very standard, but then watching it back, after you know what happens, her words have double meanings behind them. We then get this awesome segment where the show really takes advantage of its rotating stage, and they rewind and go back to the night at the beginning of Helpless during the Winter's Ball, the night that Hamilton and Eliza first met. Angelica mentions that she actually also fell in love with Hamilton at first sight, and realized that Hamilton would be the perfect man for her, since he was one of the few people who seemed to be able to keep up with her intellectually. But then she saw that same face in Eliza, smitten by Alexander. Angelica then realizes 3 things, 3 fundamental truths, at the exact same time. So I'll just provide the spark notes of that. 1, she's the eldest child, so it's her job to climb the social ladder, so she can't exactly marry a penniless guy like Hamilton. 2, she knows that Hamilton is trying to court her for her status and money, and given her intelligence, she wouldn't be able to see past that, while Eliza probably could, because she's just so in love. And 3, Angelica and Eliza are very similar. They know and love each other very much, and Angelica knows that if she admitted to liking Hamilton, she would just bury her own feelings for her sister's sake. So Angelica decides to shoulder that burden herself. It's for all these reasons that she decides to introduce Hamilton to Eliza, rather than try to pursue him herself. She takes solace in the fact that at least Hamilton's still in her life, and he's not completely gone as her brother-in-law. It gets to a bit in the end where she basically smiles through her tears, and the actress who played Angelica the night that I saw it did an absolutely fantastic job of portraying that hidden pain. It's a really powerful ballad, that song is. And it stands to reason that it's very popular among I know several people who actually say that Satisfied is their favorite song in the entire show. Which, I mean, fair enough. Anyway, after this we get the Story of Tonight reprise. It's the same type of song, except this time it's it's more of a parody of the original song because the Four Musketeers are all drunk at this point. It's funny that Lawrence says that if Hamilton can get married, there's hope for the rest of them. Because that's what he says. Lawrence is like, oh, if the Tomcat can get married, which Hamilton actually got called, if he can get married, there's hope for us after all. And they're just like joking around, having a good time while drunk. It's kind of ironic that Lawrence says that because Hamilton was actually the last to get married out of those four. Mulligan was the first married, followed by Lafayette, then Lawrence, and yeah, Hamilton was the last of the four. Burr shows up and congratulates Hamilton personally, before then alienating himself from the other musketeers by refusing to play along with their rapping antics, almost like he's trying to act more mature than the other three. It's also mentioned that these characters' verse trading can be used to show their commitment to the revolution. The fact that Burr refuses to participate and play along suggests that he's not as committed to the revolution as the others, making him untrustworthy in Lafayette's eyes and the audience's by extension, which is shown when Lafayette's just like, "You are the worst, Burr." We then see Burr, who expresses that he wants Hamilton's position because of the prestige and political power of being Washington's right-hand man, while Hamilton still wants to fight and possibly die, anything to elevate his status in his life or the next. Hamilton's just like, oh, I wish I was in your position, and Burr was like, no, you don't. Anyway, Hamilton also shows that he still sees Burr as a friend, and that they have kind of a complicated relationship. Since he goes to leave after being confronted by the other musketeers, and Hamilton tells Burr to stay and shoos the other three away. He never completely cuts Burr off. Like, throughout the entire show, he never completely cuts him off, choosing to argue out their differences instead. Though this exchange is still showing how they genuinely appreciate each other. Burr even telling Hamilton to just smile more, as if to say to be happy with what he has, especially since Burr is envious to what Hamilton has. Hamilton said, Burr also divulges, well actually, before Lawrence left, he had said that, oh, you've got someone on the side, you're seeing someone on the side, and Hamilton's like, oh, after he shoos him away, he's like, oh, I wish you brought this girl with you. And then Burr's like, oh, you're very kind, but it's illegal because he's married. Yeah, she's married. She's married to a British officer. And Hamilton's like, oh, shit. But Hamilton still, possibly because he's drunk, Hamilton's just like, I don't understand why you don't just go for what you have. And Burr kind of answers this question in his song, Wait For It. This is one of my favorite songs in the entire show, by the way. It gives us a rare insight into Burr's mentality for why he does what he does, and it acts like a soliloquy for him. Not to mention, it sounds great. We find that Burr finds many things in life to be indiscriminate between good and bad people, including love, death, life, and even Hamilton himself, kind of implying that Hamilton's a force of nature. He lives by the rule of all good things come to those who wait. Also, after the first verse, he doesn't actually go into the chorus, like you would with most songs. Instead, he just goes straight to the second verse, almost like Burr is holding himself back the same way he always does. The mention of legacy also comes back in this song. Hamilton always goes in guns blazing, partly because he has nothing to lose. He has no legacy, so it's just a matter of making one. Whereas Burr's parents left him without a lot, not many memories, since they died when he was 2. so he can only keep their memories alive to protect their legacy. And the thing is, every move he makes could potentially jeopardize that. Because he's had so much tragedy in life, everyone who loves him has died and will die before him. He has a rather fatalistic worldview that questions why he seems to outlive everyone. If there's a grand reason, he's willing to wait for it. Genius Lyrics mentions again, some significance may be seen in the fact that Burr feels the need to tell himself that life is unpredictable and the only thing he can really control is his own actions. The subsequent section of the song would suggest that this reminder is to counteract the increasing frustration he feels at his and Hamilton's parallel paths in life. Hamilton, it seems, beats Burr to every goal, so Burr is reassuring himself that if he takes it all with his typical attitude and awaits better circumstances, the opportunities will come. And rather than Hamilton, who always acts immediately, Burr always sits back and waits and sees and plans for the perfect opportunities, choosing to see which way the wind blows. It almost seems like he's trying to convince himself in this song that his strategy in life is the right one. He sees Hamilton's ambitions as being impossible and exhausting, but wonders how Hamilton succeeds in spite of Burr's philosophy to life. I wonder if this will affect his actions in the future. This song also gets to the heart of the difference between Hamilton and Burr, who, in case you haven't noticed yet, are definitely the two most important characters in the show. Although they're both brilliant, they're both orphans, they're both statesmen to be, Hamilton's parents left him with a legacy to overcome and rise above. Burr's parents left him with a legacy to protect. Given this difference, it makes sense that Hamilton would take more risks and Burr would take fewer. Hamilton's only risking his own legacy, whereas Burr has been entrusted with his parents' legacy as well, and therefore he kind of risks more whenever he speaks. It is really interesting. The two of them are kind of the opposite sides to the same coin. If they were born into different families, their lives might have actually been reversed. Who knows? Next up, we get Stay Alive. The next song is Stay Alive. And at this point in the show, we see a British soldier fire a rifle and a dancer, an ensemble member, basically representing the bullet, slowly approaching Hamilton, who's just sitting, writing on his desk, completely unaware of the shot, as the bullet just narrowly misses him. Which kind of reminds us just how dangerous it is to be where Hamilton is right now. So Hamilton and Washington are dealing with an issue that Congress is not giving them the funds that they really need to fight. They're outmatched. They're outgunned, outplanned, outnumbered, outplanned. So Hamilton and Washington decide to go with the play of guerrilla warfare. Striking hard, striking fast, and striking undetected, basically in a not very fair way, since they realize that they can't fight directly against Britain, who have better equipment and better trained soldiers. The Four Musketeers do their own stuff. Mulligan goes back to his apprenticeship, totally. Lafayette goes to France to try and get aid from them. Lawrence and Hamilton stay in the war, mostly writing essays, some of them against slavery. Actually, in Lawrence's case, most of them are against slavery. Hamilton keeps trying to get Washington to give him command so he can fight in the war, but Washington keeps dismissing him. Maybe because he's too valuable to die, or maybe another reason, I don't know. Instead, he promotes General Lee, or as I like to refer to him as, Mr. I'm a General! Whee! Anyway, Lee completely screws up in the Battle of Monmouth and gets replaced by Lafayette, despite Hamilton wanting him to be the replacement. General Lee then goes on a slander campaign against Washington. Hamill believes that Lee needs to answer for what he's said, but Washington urges him not to since it's a waste of time, as they're fighting a war and history will prove him wrong. Not to mention, Washington's name has been through a lot, he can handle this. And Hamilton can't really do anything about it, because he can't exactly, go back. He can't exactly disobey a direct order for his commander. So Lawrence says that he'll do it instead, which is where we then get into the 10 duel commandments. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of dueling, it is a traditional means of settling disputes by shooting each other in the fucking face. It was very, well, actually it was illegal at this time, but it was still regarded as a means of settling disputes. So the 10 duel commandments are a version of the Code Duello, written in 1777 by a bunch of Irishmen about the rules of dueling. The 10 used in this song are as follows in this SparkNotes version of the rules. Number 1, satisfaction is the word. If they apologize and both parties are happy, you don't really need to do anything else after that. Number 2, if number 1 doesn't succeed, get a friend or a second. The 2 seconds will try and resolve things themselves. Number 3, get the seconds to negotiate peace or a time and place if it all falls apart. This is usually the point where most arguments end, and actual shooting happens rather rarely. Number 4, if it continues, get a doctor on site, pay him up front, and have him turn around so he can have deniability. Because remember, dueling was technically illegal. So make sure the doctor can claim ignorance to the knowledge of a duel happening, because otherwise the doctor could get prosecuted himself if, he knew that a duel was going to happen but didn't do anything about it. Anyway, number 5, duel at dawn and no later, so everyone has time to sober up and rethink, and nobody has the unfair disadvantage of the sun in their eyes. And also so they're less likely to get caught when it's still kinda dark. Number 6, leave a note to your next of kin and tell them where you're going. Number 7, confess your sins. Number 8, send in your seconds one last time to see if they can fix things. We then get Hamilton, who's acting as Lawrence's second, and Burr, who is acting as Lee's. The two of them try to resolve issues, but it's basically just like they both agree that duels are dumb and immature, but Hamilton's just like, he needs to pay for what he said. Like how many people died because of Lee's actions? So they can't really fix things. Anyway, number 9, don't shoot into the sky. It's actually mentioned, it's stupid to shoot into the sky, because if you weren't planning on shooting, someone should have apologized before it reached that point. Honestly, it would be very stupid for anyone to break that rule. Number 10, count to 10 paces and then fire. The duel happens rather quickly. Lawrence ends up winning the duel, and Lee gets hospitalized. However, Washington finds out what's going on. He is furious about this and demands that Hamilton can't stir the pot that badly to the point of infighting. Well, actually, before he does that, Washington's like, meet me inside, Hamilton. And then he starts grilling him in private, which is very courteous of Washington. It's not very nice for someone to, insult or humiliate someone in front of their friends and that. But he says that Hamilton can't be infighting like this. Hamilton refuses to listen, and he actually loathes Washington calling him son. Like, Washington calls Hamilton's son multiple times in this song, and Hamilton is not having it. He gets more and more annoyed by it, before eventually lashing out at Washington. This kind of is interesting. Hamilton never knew his father, and Washington never had kids. So he's kind of... So yeah, I guess, in a way, Washington kind of sees Hamilton almost like a son, but Hamilton doesn't want to be seen as that. He wants to be seen as his own man. And also, yeah, paternal figures haven't really been too kind on him in the past. Washington ends up telling Hamilton to go home. After Hamilton gets home, Eliza's there to greet him. In some that would be enough. After Hamilton gets home, Eliza reveals that she's pregnant, and she had actually written to Washington a month prior to try and keep him alive, which was why Washington refused to put Hamilton on the front lines. The very first line in this song is great. Look around at how lucky we are to be alive right now. I love it. It's a callback to the Schuyler Sisters and kind of shows Eliza's personal philosophy. Sure, the Schuyler Sisters illustrated that Angelica's the brightest political light among these women, but Eliza also happily supported and espoused her views. As this song reiterates, Eliza supports the revolution, but she makes it known that she cares more about the human element than anything else. Being able to relish being alive and appreciate the benefits of what you fight for is important to her. Their new son, Philip, is as much a part of the revolution to her as any battle. This song also shows how hard Hamilton gets hit by the idea of having a son. He talks a lot less in this song and just listens, as well as being given a reason to stay alive during this war, because beforehand Hamilton was like, oh, I'm gonna die on the battlefield, but now he knows that he has a son, and it makes things a lot more real, and it makes him a lot more afraid to die. Eliza shows how much she loves Hamilton, stating that she really doesn't care if he's poor or broke. She just loves him for who he is, not for his status or money. Showing kind of a difference between her and Angelica, who's a lot more concerned about status. Eliza cares less about having a legacy than Hamilton does, which is a bit ironic considering what she does in the end. But yeah, That Would Be Enough is a really, really beautiful song. Really lovely. And so then we get into another intense high energy song, Guns and Ships. This is the song that everyone's tried to learn because it has a fast part in it that is actually the fastest set of lyrics in Broadway history. 19 words in 3 seconds. And I'm not going to do it here because, honestly, my skills are just so unfathomable that none of you would even be able to comprehend what you just heard. Because, like, you just wouldn't be able to make a single word out of the verbal sludge I would sling. Anyway, Lin-Manuel Miranda, who, in case you don't know, because I forgot to mention in the introduction of Hamilton, he's the guy who wrote, composed, and directed the whole of Hamilton, as well as the guy who actually played Hamilton himself. So yeah, he wrote a show and then put himself as the lead character. That is quite the power move. But anyway, Lin-Manuel Miranda says that Lafayette has this great arc where he starts out in Aaron Burser. No, wait. He starts out in My Shot rhyming out words that don't really rhyme, and he can't really figure it out. As he becomes more comfortable and a general, he can all of a sudden do this really complicated, technical, fast stuff. It's like him mastering the language. Basically, at this point in time, Lafayette has been wrecking shop in the war, even managing to get French aid for the war. He and Washington work out a way to win the war, but they need Hamilton, the right-hand man, for it to work. Washington then sends a letter to Hamilton, and he is once again asking for his tactical support. Obviously, Hamilton, not one to pass up an opportunity, returns to Washington, and then we get Washington's theme, actually, his theme song, "History Has Its Eyes on You," which is, I think, as far as theme songs go, this is actually the shortest one out of all of them, which is a shame because it's great. Washington warns Hamilton that history has its eyes on both of them. He laments his first command ever, and how the world has been watching his actions ever since then. He's warning Hamilton that he has no control over what people will say about him in the future. Washington has been aware of this for years, while Hamilton still needs to learn this, especially considering how ambitious and overconfident he is. For Hamilton, the advice is well timed, as he finally takes command of a regiment, a post he's dreamed of for so long, in pursuit of glory. Washington warns him to forget his ambition. Don't be rash or take risks with your life or those of your men. Don't be overconfident in the chance of your success, or think that failure will nevertheless bring glory. Tread carefully and with an aim not only to win, but to survive. No matter what course you take, your fate and legacy are out of your hands. This leads us into Yorktown, the world turned upside down. This is the climax of the entire conflict of the musical, or at least the first act, when it was all about fighting in a war and preserving a legacy through glory. So, obviously, every major character in the conflict comes back. Hamilton commands alongside Lafayette, and they begin their movements. Hamilton notes how he's finally where he's wanted to be for ages, ready to fight and die for his country, but then he remembers Eliza and his unborn child, and he remembers that he'll fight, but he can't die. He can't be rash, and he needs to get the job done. Dying and losing are not options. Lawrence, meanwhile, is fighting in the war elsewhere, and Lafayette is waiting to cut the British off at sea. They knew that this would work because a spy had been feeding them information the whole time. A spy named Hercules Mulligan! His tailor job allowed him to win the trust of British soldiers and get information from them, which he then gave to the revolutionaries. Ha! Those idiots! They battle, and after a week, the British surrender. We then get a cool moment, I think. I reckon it's really cool, where when the two sides are organizing the terms and conditions, one might expect negotiators to make them, but instead, you have a Brit representing King George and George Washington himself. I always loved that, how, like, Washington goes to handle the negotiations himself. It's like if two kingdoms were to fight each other, and then, like, they decide to negotiate a peace. So it's like one kingdom sends, like a pawn to negotiate, but then the other kingdom, the king goes himself. That's sick. That's badass. Anyway, this leads to the war being called off, with the Americans being granted their freedom. As the song states, the world turned upside down. Could you imagine what the world would be like now if the outcome was different? So, what happens next? Well, King George asks that same question in the next song. What comes next? Oh, flawless segue. It's basically You'll Be Back, but with different lyrics, and only one verse. King George goes from being confident that America will surrender or be destroyed in this war, but then America wins, and he's like, what? Well, fine. If you don't wish... But you'll wish that you were part of our empire again, because you'll realize how hard it is to lead. Next, we get to one of my favorite songs in the entire show. Actually, no, my second favorite song in the entire show, Dear Theodosia. The opening piano chord is absolutely beautiful. And what the song is about just makes it even more beautiful. It's a duet sung by Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton to their respective children, Theodosia Burr and Philip Hamilton. This song goes on about how both of them want their children to achieve and what they strive to do and be for their children. We also see several parallels between Burr and Hamilton as people. They both had absent fathers in their lives for different reasons, but strive to be around for their kids and make the world safe for them. It's a love song. It is a love song, but it's parental love rather than romantic love, which is rather unusual, actually. Very few things are stronger than a devoted parent's love for their child, and this song really shows this. It's a beautiful song that's optimistic towards the journey that is parenthood. A journey that I'm not traveling myself, just so you know, but I still love this song. They are certain that their children will do great things in life, so great that they'll just get blown away by the greatness. Immediately after that, we have Lawrence Interlude, otherwise known as Tomorrow There'll Be More of Us. Eliza reads Hamilton a letter from Lawrence's father, explaining how Lawrence was killed by a British gunman after the war was already won. While this letter is being read to Hamilton, Lawrence's ghost sings The Story of Tonight, and the lyrics take on a totally different meaning now. Lin-Manuel Miranda goes to the extra effort of mentioning that Lawrence's dream died with him. Fun fact, this is actually the only song in the entire show that involves speaking. As in, no singing, no rapping, or even speaking in prose. It's just a normal conversation between Hamilton and Eliza, like you would have in real life. It's also the only song that isn't in the track listing of Hamilton. So even people who know the album front to back will be surprised by this. It's to show how, well, Hamilton is just as surprised as the audience here, because Lawrence died so suddenly. The song sends a big message to Hamilton, and possibly the audience themselves. If you die before you actually achieve your goals and dreams, those dreams will die with you. Which may not matter if you have a very personal goal that will die with you regardless, but a goal that may change the world, like Hamilton's, or one that's all about legacy, that's going to matter more. Hamilton then declares that he has so much work to do, and then we get into Non-Stop, my favorite song in the entire musical. We get into Burr and Hamilton explaining what they did after the war, other than getting kids, obviously. They both started practicing law, even working next door from each other. Burr mentions how both of them started at the same time, but Hamilton advanced so much further, so much quicker than Burr, due to his absolutely tireless diligence and passion. Chernow highlights Hamilton and Burr's different approaches to the practice of law. And by the way, I'm talking about real-life Hamilton and Burr here. Though Hamilton appreciated that Burr could be resourceful in court, he found something empty beneath the surface. It's certain that at the bar he's more remarkable for ingenuity and dexterity than for sound judgment or good logic, he said. On another occasion, Hamilton elaborated on this critique. His arguments at the bar were concise, his address was pleasing, his manners were more. They were fascinating. When I analyzed his arguments, I could never discern in what his greatness consisted. Hamilton venerated the law, while Burr often seemed mildly bored and cynical about it. The law's whatever is successfully argued and plausibly maintained, he stated. By the way, I would love to see a TV series that's like a legal drama, but with Hamilton and Burr as the defense lawyers, and they're both just bantering off each other. I reckon it'd be really funny. Hamilton sees the cases he is a part of with some funny optimism behind it all, being excited that he's part of the first murder trial of their nation, while Burr is much more businesslike with his attitude, being succinct and to the point. Funny story from a Burr historian, James Parton, actually. So Parton had said, the first time that the two men jointly defended a client, the question came up as to who would speak first and who would sum up. Protocol stipulated that the lead attorney would do the summation, and Hamilton wished to be that one. Burr was so offended by this patent vanity that in his opening speech he tried to anticipate all the points that Hamilton would likely make, and apparently he was so effective at this that Hamilton, embarrassed, had nothing to say at the end. If the story is true, it was one of the few times that Alexander Hamilton was ever left speechless. This exchange also shows more differences between Hamilton and Burr's approaches in court. Hamilton would batter his opponents with arguments until they couldn't possibly comprehend and address everything he said, whereas Burr would play more sneakily, using cunning ruses and unexpected tricks, as well as also being more convincing with his arguments. This is actually one of the few times in the musical that shows Burr's mentality as being more effective than Hamilton's as lawyers. Burr waits for the perfect opportunity before striking, which tends to be more effective. We see Burr's annoyance with Hamilton, who seems to always speak his mind because everything he says is pure gold, at least according to Hamilton. Burr questions why Hamilton always writes like he's running out of time, a question that Hamilton had actually already answered when the two first met. Where he came from, most people didn't live as long as him, if you recall my shot. He says this. So he works to make every moment last. Also, considering how he found out that Lawrence, his best friend, had died while he was young very suddenly, it reminded Hamilton that nobody's immortal, so he started pouring himself into his work, maybe to distract himself, or maybe also so he could leave something behind if he died, a legacy. I kind of getting why this is my favorite song. Hamilton shows to be rather cocky considering he says he practiced the law and practically perfected it, but he also showed to have a strong sense of justice in his legal career, where he took on unpopular cases if he believed the defendants were in the right. Most famously, he defended Tories that were sued by New York patriots using an unconstitutional law. Similarly, he stood behind his unpopular policy positions by invoking justice. Additionally, Hamilton made a number of sacrifices to those who were in distress through no fault of their own. He and Eliza took in strays and waifs throughout their career, including the orphaned goddaughter Fanny Anthill, their orphaned nephew Philip Schuyler, and the imprisoned Lafayette's son, Georges de Lafayette. Hamilton gets chosen for the Constitutional Convention, and he seemed pretty happy about it. That was basically his reaction, to be honest. Hamilton came onto the Constitutional Convention scene just as he's portrayed in the show, a young and somewhat cocky upstart. He shook up the current belief with his position and made a lot of enemies just from this alone. In essence, Hamilton hoped the United States would become an aristocratic, strongly centralized, coercive, but representative union, with devices to give weight to the influence of class and property. But, to be fair to everyone else at the convention, the details of his plan were pretty extreme. He thought all elected officials should serve during good behavior. For example, indefinitely, essentially creating a government powered by a centralized and elite class of bureaucrats, which is kind of what a lot of parliaments have kind of become. He also cited the British government as the best in the world, which would not have been very popular considering they just fought a war against the British government. Madison flat out called his idea for a life-term president an elective monarch. Because yeah, he wanted a president that served for life. Which I'll elaborate more on why he thought this later on. Burr warns Hamilton in the song that Hamilton's tendency to always state his beliefs loudly and unapologetically will give him plenty of enemies who will try to bring him down. I wonder if that's going to be brought up again. Hamilton ends up speaking with Burr in the middle of the night. And Genius Lyrics had actually picked up how, instead of asking whether or not Hamilton is okay, or if anything has happened with his family, he suggests that the only reason Alexander would show up at his house in the middle of the night is on urgent business related to their job, considering that the first thing he says is this a legal matter? This seems to suggest that the relationship between Hamilton and Burr has deteriorated somewhat since the end of the war. The fact that it's lost some of its more brotherly aspects of friendship and trust. However, they still get along well enough to be willing to ask for and provide help for each other, so there's that. We also see one of the few times that Hamilton actually admits that someone else is flat out better than him at something, and it's to Aaron Burr of all people, who's been envious of Hamilton for years, possibly over a decade now. It makes sense why Burr would be rather surprised by this statement. More examples of how Burr and Hamilton differ. First off, I'll say Hamilton has come up to Burr to be like, hey, I need some help defending the new US Constitution. I have a plan to write a series of essays, anonymously published, defending the document to the public, and I would like your help in it because you are a better lawyer than me. We have more examples here of how Burr and Hamilton differ. Burr is too cautious and fears the worst case scenario, assuming that it'll always happen. Hamilton is so confident in this series of essays that he is certain that it will succeed. Burr finds every excuse to not support the Constitution openly, even though he still supports it, but Hamilton has an answer for everything, stating that American independence itself had so many contradictions itself that claiming the Constitution's the same isn't even a valid argument. And also saying, we have to start somewhere. Burr goes to end the conversation by saying goodnight, but Hamilton stops him. At this point, he's kind of lost his patience for all of this, asking why bother fighting in the War of Independence and then take no interest in shaping their new nation. Burr is too worried about supporting something that'll end up failing that he won't even try. He won't support anything if he isn't certain it will work. Hamilton has never understood Burr's talk less, smile more, and this point just serves to further show that. The fact that he's stating his confusion directly is in and of itself something Burr would likely never do. Even Burr's answer to that query somewhat dodges the question, saying that he's keeping his plans close to his chest and is seeing which way the wind will blow. And quick side note actually, there's an animatic I saw of Non-Stop, and in case you don't know what an animatic is, it's basically like it's like an animation but not finished yet. So it's like, it's not in full motion and it's not in color. It's like sketches, but it's still showing a story. And there's this one animatic I saw where Burr actually sees images of his dead loved ones for a brief second during the wait for it part of Non-Stop, where he's saying he keeps his plans close to his chest and all that. I think that's a really nice touch, and it was stuff like that that made me think there's stuff to gain from making Hamilton into a legit movie, not just a professional recording of the stage show. So it's like, I know that people had been talking about making Hamilton into a movie, and I was kind of questioning, you know, what would be the point of that, considering the musical already exists. And the movie on Disney Plus is just a recording of the musical with the original cast in it, so there's that. But yeah, when you take advantage of stuff like that you couldn't do in the musical before, it makes me think, like, you know, a movie of Hamilton could still be quite, like, it could still add a lot. At the very least, like, visually, you know? The animatic I'm talking about in particular, the video is from a YouTuber called, Shin? I'm not sure how you would pronounce it, but it's like S-Z-I-N. And I'll probably refer to it again, as there are several things in that video that I like. We then get a return to Angelica's melody in Satisfied when she shows up here, talking about how she's not really satisfied. She married a rich guy, so she's secured for life, but he isn't a lot of fun. Interestingly, it was pointed out to me that characters tend to get name-dropped the way they do in their introductory songs, like how Hamilton says Angelica here, or basically how anyone ever says Angelica, or the fact that whenever Hamilton and Burr interact with each other, Hamilton will always call him, like, Aaron Burr, sir, or Burr, sir, you know, stuff like that. It's always the same way. Anyway, we then get to, after Angelica leaves off to London, Eliza shows up, and we get That Would Be Enough again, and it's played faster, showing that Eliza's struggling to keep up with Hamilton's non-stop pace, and she ends her verse with Would That Be Enough instead. She's insecure about if she could satisfy her husband and his workaholism, asking for just a fraction of his time, and isn't sure if he would be satisfied even if she could somehow grant him peace of mind. This song then reveals what happened with those series of essays that were talked about before. Because Burr said no, Hamilton ended up teaming up with two different founding fathers, James Madison and John Jay, to write the essays called the Federalist Papers. So the plan was to write 25 essays, the work divided evenly among the three men, which reminds me, how did they expect to divide 3 essays among 3 men? No, how were they expecting to divide 25 essays among 3 men? Unless they were, like, planning on writing 1/3 of an essay each. But it doesn't really matter because it wasn't equal in the end. In the end, they actually wrote 85 essays in the span of 6 months. And as Burr will tell you, John Jay got sick after writing 5, Madison wrote 29, Hamilton wrote the other 51! I tell you what, this song is the only one that gets me hyped over the concept of writing essays of all things. Like, credit to Madison, he gave 100%, 110% in this project. He actually wrote more essays than they were supposed to write altogether, but Hamilton gave 500%. He wrote, like, almost twice that number. And the music just makes it even more hype. Burr marvels over how Hamilton can write so much in such little time. Shin's animatic shows Hamilton frantically writing, his back to the camera, as papers fly behind him in a flurry right past Burr. Also, the line, "Are you running out of time?" is made pretty awkward by the fact that Hamilton actually is hyper-aware of his own mortality. Lawrence died young and suddenly. There's nothing to suggest that Hamilton won't share the same fate. Hamilton uses his writing as a way to change the world, but also to find his place in the world. I kind of get Hamilton in this case, you know? You're not going to live forever, and afterwards, all that's left is what you've created. We then get to Washington, who has had people asking him to lead as president, and he admits he doesn't know everything in this case. So this is where he decides to set up a cabinet to help him out, which originally consisted of 4 members, asking Hamilton to be one of those members. Hamilton accepted the offer much more quickly than Washington expected him to. Like, Washington had like a full speech prepared to try and convince him, and Hamilton's just immediately just like, yes. Say less, it's a yes from me. The music in this sequence is History Has Its Eyes on You. And yeah, he clearly had a whole speech set up and prepared. Or at the very least, even if Hamilton was eager right from the start, usually you're supposed to pretend to, you know, be very busy or uninterested, so then Washington would have to, like, try to convince him, but Hamilton's just like, nah. I want in. Actually, Thomas Jefferson wrote about what he thought was happening at home in terms of cabinet positions while still in Paris. So he had said, bills were brought in for establishing departments of foreign affairs, finance, and war. The last would certainly be given to General Knox, who actually got name-dropped in Right-Hand Man. Mr. J would probably have his choice of the first and second, and it was supposedly Hamilton. It was supposed Hamilton would have whichever Mr. J declined, which is kind of ironic because, from what I remember, John Jay actually was never part of the American cabinet. Like, Hamilton got asked first, and John Jay actually never got asked to join the cabinet, from what I remember. He was never part of it. Hamilton obviously became Secretary of Treasury. And then, yeah, Knox did become the Secretary of War, but the Secretary of State ended up becoming Thomas Jefferson himself. And then you also have Attorney General Edmund Randolph. So yeah, Jefferson was kind of wrong about that. Anyway, Hamilton then gets confronted by Eliza, and he responds by using her own words against her as justification for asking her to lead. By saying, look around at how lucky we are to be alive right now. Eliza claims to be helpless, which, if I remember from Helpless, Hamilton had said that she would never feel that way. So, uh-oh. That doesn't sound good. also really nice musical moment, Eliza's "That Would Be Enough" theme morphs and bleeds into Angelica's "Satisfied" motif as she comes to understand more of what Angelica saw in Alexander the first time she met him. Eliza's theme was originally an expression of love. Hamilton only needs to stay by her side for her to be satisfied. In Non-Stop, she begins to realize that the same is emphatically not true for Hamilton, as he's never satisfied. His boundless ambition keeps him moving in ways that seem to take him further away from Eliza and from their home. Eliza asks what would be enough to be satisfied, hoping that Alexander will realize that taking the job as Treasury Secretary isn't going to make him truly fulfilled, while she simultaneously betrays her new suspicion that nothing will, including herself. We then get to the best part of the song. 4 different songs all being sung at once, and they're all different characters' themes. Like, we have Satisfied, That Would Be Enough, History Has Its Eyes on You, and Non-Stop itself. Ugh. Actually, History Has Its Eyes on You. This line is also an interesting inversion of Washington's meaning behind the History Has Its Eyes on You line. When Washington said it, it was meant to be a warning that history will remember your mistakes. But here, it's treated as a motivation. Hamilton has the opportunity to make history, so he won't throw away his shot at doing so. Foreshadowing? I don't know. The final part leads to My Shot and Alexander Hamilton callbacks as well, finalizing with Hamilton declaring that he's not throwing away his shot, and then a final gunshot to end off the first part. This is partly why this is my favorite song. It incorporates every single major character's theme in the song at some point, while still being its own thing. It has every character's theme in it. Hamilton's, which is Alexander Hamilton, Burr's, which is Wait for It, Washington's, which is History Has Its Eyes on You, Eliza's, which is Helpless, and Angelica's, which is Satisfied, as well as also having My Shot and Non-Stop itself being its own song. It also sets up and foreshadows so much stuff that happens in Act 2, and it sounds awesome. And you know what's even more awesome? That animatic's final part. During the bit that's leading up to, like, I am not throwing away my shot, you have the chorus, you have the ensemble saying, just you wait afterwards. Almost like they're saying, just you wait, you'll throw away your shot eventually. And it almost kind of sets up a potential downfall, almost. Don't know why it would do that. But we also get introduced to several... The animatic shows shots of several characters who are going to become more significant in the second act. We get Aaron Burr looking almost disdainful at Hamilton. We get a certain woman in a red dress that's looking kind of depressed. We get James Madison, the co-author of the Federalist Papers, staring up with an almost blank expression. And then finally we get a certain gentleman dressed in purple. His face is not shown, but we see him smiling, almost like it's setting this person up to be like the final boss or the main antagonist of this show. As mentioned before, we finally get a single gunshot as the final note of the song, and the whole stage goes black, ending Act 1. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed listening to my very long video. It has gone for an hour and a half. I was not expecting it to go for that long. But I hope you guys stay tuned for Act 2, which will be coming in due time. I've already got it all written up. It's just a matter of picking the times. So anyway, hope you all enjoyed. And until next time, have a good one.